Welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions, everyone. This is the only podcast, at least the only one that we know of, that psychoanalyzes every episode of Batman the Animated Series. My name is Brian Ward, and as always, I'm joined by the lovely and talented Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
Andrea, we're going to start the week off with a bit of a sad note, I'm afraid. This past week saw the death of ARKHAM Sessions Jr., who anyone listening to this podcast knows as the voice of Alfred Pennyworth.
Right.
Of course, he was also an accomplished television actor prior to joining Batman the Animated Series. Personally, I remember him best as Dandy Jim Buckley from Maverick. But he was also probably actually best known for his roles as Stu Bailey on 77 Sunset Strip and Inspector Louis Erskine on the FBI. Sadly, Mr. Zimbalist passed away on May 2nd, and he was 95 years old.
He will be missed.
On to better things. Psychology and Batman.
Right.
On this week's episode, we're focusing on the two-parter Feet of Clay. And yes, we're doing both parts in this episode. The two episodes were written by Marv Wolfman and Michael Reeves, respectively. Wolfman, of course, a bit of a legend of the comics industry. He created Blade and the Teen Titans and co-created the villain Bullseye, amongst others. And he had a decent run on Batman, where he actually created Tim Drake. So Marv is fully capable of contributing to Batman the Animated Series. And Michael Reeves, of course, is also a master of writing for animation, having worked on Disney's Gargoyles and then this series, as well as others. And he was actually one of the four BTAS writers in 1993 that ended up taking home the Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing for an Animated Program for Batman the Animated Series. So Clayface's origin is in excellent hands this week.
This is probably another well-known and highly acclaimed episode or couple of episodes featuring another villain that many people know about, Clayface, and his really unique and fascinating origin story, which is handled and presented really well.
Yeah, and it's unique to the series. Of course, this isn't the first time we've seen Clayface. That character's been in the comics since 1940 when his alter ego was Basil Carlo, a B-movie actor who took on the role of his character from his movies. And then he took on a new name in the early 60s when Matt Hagen was introduced. Hagen was basically a treasure hunter who was given the ability to shapeshift after coming into contact with this radioactive substance, and he became Clayface. But actually, Clayface has had several iterations over the decades. I mean, Basil Carlo and Matt Hagen were the first two, of course, but we've also had Sandra Fuller and Preston Payne, and then their son Cassius. Let's see who else. We've got Dr. Malley and Johnny Williams, and I'm missing someone. Todd Russell. And the cool thing about it is that these characters are all independent of one another. Like several of them have actually met. I mean, not to get on too much of a tangent, but Preston and Sandra and Basil and Matt all joined forces at one point and became the Mud Pack.
What?
Yes.
So like it's like a Clayface club.
Yeah, like Sandra was known as Lady Clay. And she and the third Clayface, Preston, they ended up breaking the first Clayface out of prison. And also the second one, I believe, was in prison. They got him out. The four of them got together. Batman took them all on and ended up winning. And then Preston Payne and Sandra Fuller actually had a kid. They had Cassius Clay.
A little
Payne.
baby Clay.
They did. It was Cassius Clay Payne. Cassius Clay, of course, is the name of Muhammad Ali before he became Muhammad Ali. And little baby Clay was a Clayface.
So this is all back in the comics, in Batman comics. The Clayface that we learn of here in BTAS, this particular story in regards to how he becomes Clayface is unique to BTAS.
It's an interesting sort of combination between the original Clayface, Basil, and the second Clayface, Matt Hagen. because Basil was a B movie actor.
Right.
And Matt Hagen in Batman the Animated Series is an actor.
Yeah.
So we can certainly talk about that.
Yeah, it has interesting themes of, vanity and appearance and performance and dealing with changes and dealing with, as we'll talk about, with trauma.
Yeah. So let's talk about Feet of Clay. We start out at the Gotham Island tramway. Lucius Fox is there to deliver a series of incriminating documents to Bruce Wayne. Of course, we learn that Bruce isn't interested in using these documents to bring down Roland Daggett, who wants to control Wayne Enterprises himself. He instead wants to kill Fox and take the documents for himself. Of course, we know this can't possibly be Bruce Wayne, but if we needed any absolute proof, we cut to Batman, who hears a series of shotgun blasts and goes to investigate. Naturally, he takes down the common thugs, but the Bruce Wayne imposter gets away. And before we can get to Lucius, who's unconscious on the ground, the cops get to him first, and that's where we hear Lucius declare,
Wayne. Bruce Wayne.
We're then introduced to Matt Hagen at Imperial Pictures. Andrea, if you remember a couple weeks back, we mentioned Hagen at the end of the episode, Beware the Grey Ghost, because he too was gracing the cover of People Weekly. Now, this is actually one of those cases where going through these episodes in their original production order actually comes in handy for us, because during this scene, we learn that Matt Hagen, the actor who's known as the Man with a Million Faces, the Man of a Million Faces, had a horrible accident that permanently disfigured his face. And on the cover of People Weekly, we see that there's a story on Matt Hagen, the Man of a Million Faces. They could clearly be writing about one of three things, really. They could be writing about his accident, or his remarkable recovery and the best movies of his career that he's had since his accident, or they could be referring to his death, but we'll get to that momentarily. It really could be any of these three, because the two-part episode, Feet of Clay, actually aired before Beware the Grey Ghost. Feet of Clay Parts 1 and 2 aired on September 8th and 9th, 1992, while Beware the Grey Ghost aired almost 2 full months later on November 4th. So it's interesting, if you were to watch it in broadcast order, there's an article on Matt Hagen, presumably after we see the end of these episodes. But if you were to watch it in production order, he's just a celebrity on the front of
I see.
People Weekly.
Right.
A celebrated celebrity, Matt Hagen, the Man of a Million Faces. Like I said, during this introduction to Matt Hagen, we're informed that he was in an accident and that he needs a putty-like cream created by none other than Roland Daggett that helps him mold his face back to normal. We also learned that Hagen has had to do a number of things for Daggett in order to continue to receive the cream. But first things first, Ray, let's talk about Matt Hagen's career and what it means to have a handsome or beautiful face when you're a star or starlet, and what that can do to him should he lose that asset.
Well, I really like how we're introduced to him. We first see him in his movie trailer, looking in the mirror, searching for this particular cream.
Come on, where are you?
And we see his face. He's kind of it's a mix between a zombie and the beings from Eye of the Beholder, that Twilight Zone episode, like pig-faced but zombied, but
he kind of actually reminds me of I know we're crossing publishers here, but he actually kind of reminds me of Jigsaw from the Punisher comics. Lots of scarring, basically a face that's been put back together.
We see that he's very grotesque, and so our understanding, of course, is that he's been in some accident. He didn't always look this way. He used to be a handsome, ostensibly this movie star, debonair, I'm thinking George Clooney type guy.
Sure.
Held a lot of roles, won a lot of rewards, and was known for his good looks. So for him to experience this life-altering trauma of being in a essentially a life-threatening accident, but also being permanently changed from that physically. Of course, there are psychological changes as well. He's got to completely, rethink his worldview. People are not going to see him the same way. He has to live his life completely differently. And of course, his livelihood, his career is impacted directly by this. And I imagine, we're seeing him at a point where he's already undergone or received this treatment, so to speak, where
Right.
he can alter his face back to what it used to be. But we can probably surmise that he was dealing with a lot of issues related to how am I going to live my life as this disfigured guy?
Yeah.
How am I going to have a career this way? And surely that was difficult for him to do.
As I look at this particular scene, two things. One, you come to the realization that not only does he have to be an excellent actor, but he's also got to be an amazing sculptor, because he's got to put his face together with his own hands. But more importantly, something that I realize is there so that we, the audience, can see a glimpse into Hagen's past. But I think it's fascinating that he keeps two large newspaper clippings on the mirror talking about his accident. So there's something there where every day that he goes into his trailer, he's got to be haunted by the fact that he is a man who is very different from how he had once been.
Right.
We cut away to Roland Daggett, and do I even have to say it? Daggett is a ginger. Not one of those orange-haired gingers, mind you. He has straight-up red hair, but he's a ginger nonetheless. For those of you keeping score at home, please chalk up another redhead to the villain column. Daggett, voiced by the talented Ed Asner, reveals that he's unhappy with Hagen's failure to retrieve the incriminating documents at the top of the episode, and he's decided to do away with Hagen. And sure enough, Hagen comes to retrieve more of the cream, and Daggett's thugs pin him down and dump a vat of the stuff down his mouth before leaving him inside his car.
Yeah, it's well done. It's a horrible scene because all we see really is their shadows as they're just pouring this liquidy stuff onto his face, and they're pinning him down. He's struggling.
Let's talk about this cream a little bit and his need for it.
Renew You.
Yeah, Renew You by Daggett.
Well, as we talked about, something terrible happened to him, and he was so scared that he would never look the same again. So, as you mentioned, he's really taken advantage of by Daggett when he's offered this opportunity. In exchange for this cream, you will have to work for me. You will have to do some unscrupulous things.
Right.
But the payoff is you can look the same way you did. And in fact, you can look even better. You can create, as you said, he shapes his face into the characters that he's playing.
Right.
So for him, he's looking at it like a renewal of life. This is my second chance. And, there's trauma, and we've talked about physical trauma before and the way that physical disfigurement can change your worldview. It was in our Two-Face episodes.
Yeah.
Where
also a two-parter.
Also a two-parter, and also an origin story, where we talked about how experiencing that disfigurement completely changed Harvey Dent's life. It changed his career. It changed his relationships. It really, and like we talked about with trauma, it changes their worldview. So again, this is happening with Mr. Hagen.
Yeah.
But I actually want to talk about addiction.
Yeah.
Just stay with me here on this one.
Okay.
Okay. So, what's an addiction? People know this, but I'll be clear. An addiction is a compulsive craving for a substance despite the adverse consequences. And there are often accompanying physical withdrawal symptoms and emotional stress when the substance is not being used. People know this, but again, substance abuse is incredibly common. According to the World Health Organization, more than 90 million people suffer from problems related to alcohol and drugs.
Wow.
So it's a very, very common mental health condition. Right, so I'm sure you're asking, well, what the heck does this have to do with Clayface?
Okay.
if we see this, what's it called? Renew You? If we see the Renew You cream as a chemical substance, think of it as a way that it represents him altering his state, altering his mood state, altering his physical state. We could very well make a direct parallel to an addiction. So what do you have? You have a chemical substance. This is the pharmaceutical cream. So this is the active agent that alters Mr. Hagen's appearance. But as I said, it also alters his mood, his confidence. It makes him energetic. It makes him feel like he can do his job.
Right.
He's he's more than at his best. He is the best.
Well, yeah, it's basically a performance enhancement in
Totally.
that he's even told.
I mean, you had your biggest hits after the accident.
Right. And again, it's not a psychoactive drug, which is what people usually think of when they think about addiction, but it acts in very similar ways. So for one, you have this thing called tolerance. Tolerance is the diminishing effect of the regular use of the same dose of the drug, requiring the user to take larger and larger doses before experiencing the drug's effect.
Okay.
That essentially means that in order to get the same feeling, the same high from it, the same experience, you have to take more and more of it.
Right.
Now, I don't know that we get the sense that he has to use more and more of this cream, but his assistant, he's actually trying to hide the cream away from him. He's trying to limit the amount that Hagen's using. He's incredibly worried about overuse of this particular cream.
You can't go on like this, Matt. You hurt all the time now.
The other thing we have is something called withdrawal. Withdrawal, as most people know, is the discomfort and distress that follows discontinuing the use of an addictive drug. And in fact, when we're introduced to Mr. Hagen, it looks like he's going through what could be considered a withdrawal. He's tense, he's shaking, he's irritable, he's on edge, and he's clearly in distress because he does not have his Renew You cream. Of course, the type of withdrawal symptoms does depend on what drug someone is withdrawing from. But generally speaking, a person usually feels some physical pain, an intense craving for that substance, and other physiological signs that indicate physical dependence.
Well, he's definitely got the craving. Even though he's not ingesting it, he definitely gets that feeling of need.
Right. So when we have an addiction, there is both a physical dependence and a psychological dependence, which is what Clayface is experiencing. He's got the physiological need for the drug for his body to be satiated, right? Like he really needs to have this cream so that his body can be renewed. And he also uses it to relieve the negative emotions of the disfigurement, right?
Right.
The feelings of failure, the feelings of low self-value, the feeling that he's not quite right in society and that he's not what he used to be. That's the psychological dependence piece.
Right.
So, it's not a literal explanation. It's not a literal representation of an addiction. But when I saw this episode most recently, it did come to mind that this is a symbolic representation of addiction, a lesson in what can happen to someone if they become physically and emotionally dependent on something that's altering their physiological and their emotional state. So I think it's quite profound.
Absolutely, and I think you make an excellent point. And personally, when I look at this episode, I see Hollywood actors and actresses
Totally.
and their addiction to maybe, I don't know, plastic surgery and being able to mold their faces.
Well, there's that too. Especially lately, there's a lot of obsession with perfection.
Yeah.
And now with Botox and the ease of plastic surgery and lunchtime facelifts, that addiction to cosmetic procedures and alterations is very common.
Ironically, it usually makes you look worse than when you went in, but that's all in the eye of the beholder.
Well, that kind of speaks to the addiction too, right? That a person isn't they don't have the insight that we have right now to realize that it's excessive. It's interfering with their lifestyle. It's unnecessary. And these are all things that we can, probably say about a lot of people.
Right.
It's also quite possible that this episode is talking about, drug addiction that, as you said, actors and actresses may engage in.
Sure.
The one I thought about was cocaine. It's a very addictive substance, and the entertainers that use cocaine will use it as a stimulant. It causes euphoria, it causes a confidence boost and a lot of energy. And some entertainers and performers say that cocaine allows them to be in a very productive and creative state. But again, just like any illicit substance, it causes cardiovascular stress. It can cause paranoia and suspiciousness, and of course, a depressive crash when you're withdrawing.
Right. So Batman learns that his alter ego, Bruce Wayne, has been implicated for the attempted murder of Lucius Fox, and he goes looking for answers. He finds Daggett's thug, Raymond Bell, and terrifies him with some really dangerous flying of the Batwing. But Bell faints before he can end up giving Batman any real info. So Bruce pays Lucius a visit at the Gotham City Hospital. So Andrea, talk about what Lucius is going through here, because there was an attempt on his life by one of his good friends and his boss, Bruce Wayne. And, now he is in the hospital room and he just receives a visit from Bruce. And he's freaking out considerably.
Yeah, well, he should be, because he was betrayed by a person that looked, spoke, and acted, at least at first, like Bruce Wayne.
Right.
Right? And then there was that betrayal and, let's not forget, some head trauma.
Right.
Fox was hit in the head by a sign when one of the thugs was shooting at him.
Yeah.
And he lost consciousness. He was actually hit in the back of the head in the very same spot that Bruce Wayne was hit in the episode The Forgotten.
Right.
But unlike Bruce Wayne, Fox did not experience memory loss.
No, he remembers all too well.
As soon as he sees Bruce in his hospital bed, he begins to shake and quiver and say, I don't trust you. He goes for that button to call the nurse in, because he is, just traumatized. He believes that this guy's he's a completely, it's almost like, when you learn about something that completely changes your beliefs on something. He trusted and worked with Bruce for a very long time. And Bruce, or actually Hagen as Bruce, betrayed him.
So Bruce is subsequently arrested, posts bail, and elsewhere we see the effects that Daggett's vat of Renew You cream is having on Hagen. He has physically become basically a pile of malleable clay-like substance. And we learned that after his accident, Daggett visited him in the hospital, like you said, and offered him the cream, which could do for his disfigured face in seconds what plastic surgery would accomplish after years. And we learned that this basically gave him a second chance, and that Hagen actually went on to make some of his best movies after his accident. And we also learned that with a great deal of concentration, he can actually control his appearance simply by thinking about it, but not for long, and we see another signature Matt Hagen flip out.
This is a really fascinating scene, because Hagen's assistant, who's, he's quite caring. We see him go get him. He's transformed into this horrific monster.
Right.
And his assistant is caring for him. He's bringing him back to the trailer. He's packing his things for him. He's saying, maybe there's a chance. Maybe, you don't have to worry anymore. And Clayface begins to reminisce about the characters that he used to play. And like you said, he can control his transformation. He can actually control his ability to be, anything, up till the clothing. He can create the clothing out of his clay, which is convenient. So he's transforming into different characters, and his assistant is praising him and saying, look, your career isn't lost at all. But unfortunately, Clayface loses control. There's a moment where his assistant kind of goes toward him. It's kind of hard to tell. I don't know if he actually touches him, but he's offering affection, and Clayface just transforms back into his clay body, and he just goes off.
You broke my concentration. It won't work. Don't you see? It's too hard. It's like tensing a muscle. I can't keep it up for long. My career, life, it is gone.
it's as if he's now struggling with this new body. And now let's remember, when he was held down, he was pinned down by these guys, and they poured this substance onto his face. Another traumatic event for him to experience, and a complete disfigurement, completely different body. So he's struggling with his identity. He's struggling to be the person he is, in this new body. And of course, he's completely lost himself. He's lost Matt Hagen. And he even says,
I'm not an actor anymore. I'm not even a man.
It's quite sad when he says that, because he's right. He's this monster. He's this figure that can't even embody a human body for very long without losing control. So, again, there are some parallels there with addiction, with folks that have alcohol or substance abuse. When they're deep in their addiction, sometimes they will say that. They'll share that they don't feel like they're that person anymore, that they're just completely immersed in their addiction.
Right. And Clayface intends to kill Daggett as a result of all this anger. So he plans to wait until someone shows up at Lucius's hospital room to finish the job, and then he's going to become them, gain access to Daggett, and then kill him. And this man, Germs, played by Ed Begley Jr. Andrea, by the way, what I find interesting here is that both Ed Asner and Ed Begley Jr. appeared in another 90s animated series, Captain Planet and the Planeteers. Asner played Hoggish Greedley, and Begley played Preston, the zoning commissioner, and I interviewed both of them for our Captain Planet DVD, which you can buy right now. Anyway, back to Germs. Not just a catchy name. Germs is terrified of, well, germs.
This episode gives us some personality. We don't just see henchmen running around with guns. We get henchmen with these backstories and these kind of interesting characteristics and quirks. And Germs appears to have OCD. He's taking Kleenex or cloths to open doors, so he doesn't touch handles of doors. His name is Germs, so he has clearly, people know him as someone who is probably afraid to catch a disease.
And that's used against him when Batman realizes that the best possible way to get information out of him is to put him in a room full of diseases.
All these viruses and bacteria, I could be infected.
He's just surrounded by vials and jars of viruses and contaminants. And I think that was planned. Bruce Wayne begins to torture him in there.
And Batman learns from Germs that Matt Hagen is the man responsible for the attempt on Lucius's life. But Germs is swept away and taken by Clayface before he could really get any more information. And Batman certainly gives it his best shot. But ultimately, while Batman manages to save Germs in a fight with Clayface, Clayface gets away. We learn that Daggett's Renew You cream will be released to the public soon, and in an infomercial-esque interview, Daggett is confronted by a larger woman who actually turns out to be Clayface. And
it's terrifying, actually, that scene where that woman charges him, walks onto the stage, and then slowly transforms.
Yeah, and she's actually bringing up the results of the treatment, including the addiction that you talk about.
What about the addictive properties of Renew You, Mr. Daggett? How once you're hooked on it, you can't stop using it without horrible pain.
And again, Batman steps in and in the end uses Hagen's own films against him, basically overpowering him with these involuntary responses to seeing himself on screen. Not so dissimilar from what we see the T-1000 going through and the vat of molten steel in Terminator 2. Just uncontrollably changing from one character to another until eventually he fries himself out with electricity and collapses, giving us his ultimate death scene.
You know what I'd have given for a death scene like this? Too bad I won't get to read the notices.
We learn that Daggett is indeed in custody, and that Lucius is well and relieved that Bruce isn't the person who tried to kill him. But we've talked about responses to trauma in the past, and this is actually something I want to ask you. We're clearly never going to see this, and we as the audience are kind of told that Lucius knows that Bruce isn't responsible, and he's okay with that. But realistically speaking, can Lucius ever expect any residual effects from looking into the face of the man he saw trying to kill him, even if he's aware that it wasn't Bruce?
He can. He's likely to have some doubts. He's likely to have potential nightmares, flashbacks. And again, he had that head trauma. So it was a life-threatening situation that he was in. But with some time spent with Bruce, regaining that trust and working with him in a trusting relationship, it shouldn't take too long for him to be able to recover that relationship. And we imagine they were probably close as colleagues before, so hopefully they can rebuild that relationship again.
And we, of course, wouldn't want to see this be the end of our experiences with Clayface.
Right.
So through a series of tests, we also learned that the clay matter has no adverse effects to electricity. So Batman's come to the conclusion that Clayface has faked his own death. And we do see that he's absolutely right. There at the end with the woman laughing maniacally with those yellow eyes. And we're out. I know Clayface can't be treated since he's ultimately escaped, but let's discuss treatment for what he was going through as Matt Hagen.
Yeah, what I like about this episode is that, again, we do see some trauma, but we see a different response. Now, we've talked about PTSD before, but there are other incredibly common psychological responses following trauma. And there are complex psychological responses following trauma as well. So, for instance, addictions. Alcohol and substance abuse disorders are quite common following a traumatic experience. And it makes sense why. Research shows that by temporarily dulling the pain of self-awareness with drugs, someone can avoid coping with feelings like depression, anger, anxiety. And we know Mr. Hagen, aka Clayface, was struggling with low self-esteem,
Right.
Concerns about his appearance, feeling like a failure because of his disfigurement. So I like that this episode symbolically handles this idea of taking something too far and becoming dependent on some kind of chemical.
Yeah, because when Clayface is actually disguised as the woman in the interview audience, he even brings up this is what happens when you OD on this cream. He actually uses the word. So you're absolutely right with equating all of this to addiction and substance abuse.
Right. Well, he's dealing with the aftermath of becoming addicted, and this person, it's like a pusher, right? Like getting him addicted. Unfortunately, as I said, addiction is incredibly common after trauma. It's a way of coping. It's a way of self-medicating, but it's also a way of dulling or numbing that emotional pain.
So you've worked with people who have been victims of these traumas, and you've seen some of this firsthand. What does this sort of treatment look like?
So when I was working at the Veterans Hospital, actually there was basically a substance abuse clinic, and the majority of the veterans that I worked with there had both trauma-related psychological problems like depression, PTSD, mood disorders, as well as a substance abuse disorder. So the clinic primarily treated co-occurring mental illnesses like trauma and substance abuse. So a treatment that we used quite frequently is called seeking safety. It's a psychotherapy that's aimed at helping people who have both a history of trauma as well as alcohol or substance abuse disorders. And so it helps with both dealing with feeling safe again, feeling like you won't be victimized, feeling like you won't be taken advantage of, as well as learning more adaptive and safe coping. So rather than going to the bottle, rather than going to the needle, developing some more appropriate, healthy kinds of coping mechanisms.
Right.
Social support, prayer, groups, extracurricular activities, other more pro-social types of things that you would do instead of engaging in substance abuse. So that is what you would consider a cognitive behavioral therapy for trauma and substance abuse problems. So what I like about this friend / double, this other actor that he works with, who cares about him quite a lot, even at the very end, we see that he's mourning the loss of Matt Hagen. Not so much Clayface, but Matt Hagen.
Right.
And again, he's worried about him so much. We can see that he's supportive of him. And it's very reminiscent of a close friend, a colleague, or a family member who's worried about someone who's using or abusing drugs.
Right.
And so someone like that would be particularly helpful in introducing them into the therapeutic process and supporting them throughout their treatment.
So that's all for me. What about you, Drea?
For anyone interested in learning more about substance abuse disorders, PTSD, and other behavioral health issues, the place that I recommend is SAMHSA. We've mentioned SAMHSA before. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The website is www.samhsa.gov, and there is a ton of information there about services, treatments, and helpful features that can give people more information.
And we'll also be sure to put that link on underthemaskonline.com.
Absolutely.
Great. So good episodes. Good character with Clayface. Voiced, of course, we didn't say, by Ron Perlman. It's just a really good introduction to this character. I'm looking forward to seeing more from him. Come back next week when we'll talk about The Joker's Favor, which is particularly exciting for you, Drea, since this marks the very first appearance of Harley Quinn.
I'm excited.
That and more next week. Till then, be sure to leave us your ratings and reviews over on iTunes. Follow us on Twitter. We're at ARKHAM Sessions and at BWard028 and
at Arkham Asylum Doc.
And come over and like us on Facebook. As always, send in your questions and comments to arkhamsessions@gmail.com. And check out the rest of Drea's site, where she's posted her psychological analysis of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 recently.
Check it out.
Yep, definitely read that. You can find that and more at underthemaskonline.com. Till next week, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
the ARKHAM Sessions.
Blade and the Teen Titans and co-created the villain Bullseye, amongst others. And he had a decent run on Batman, where he actually created Tim Drake. So Marv is fully capable of contributing to Batman the Animated Series. And Michael Reeves, of course, is also a master of writing for animation, having worked on Disney's Gargoyles and then this series, as well as others. And he was actually one of the 4 BTAS writers in 1993 that ended up taking home the Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing for an Animated Program for Batman the Animated Series. So Clayface's origin is in excellent hands this week.
This is probably another well-known and highly acclaimed episode, or couple of episodes, featuring another villain that many people...
Fuller and Preston Payne, and then their son Cassius. Let's see who else. We've got Dr. Malley and Johnny Williams, and I'm missing someone. Todd Russell. And the cool thing about it is that these characters are all independent of one another. Like several of them have actually met. I mean, not to get on too much of a tangent, but Preston and Sandra and Basil and Matt all joined forces at one point and became the Mud Pack.
What?
Yes.
So like it's like a Clayface club.
Yeah, like Sandra was known as Lady Clay, and she and the third Clayface, Preston, they ended up breaking.
People know about Clayface and his really unique and fascinating origin story, which is handled and presented really well.
Yeah, and it's unique to the series. Of course, this isn't the first time we've seen Clayface. That character's been in the comics since 1940 when his alter ego was Basil Carlo, a B-movie actor who took on the role of his character from his movies. And then he took on a new name in the early 60s when Matt Hagen was introduced. Hagen was basically a treasure hunter who was given the ability to shapeshift after coming into contact with this radioactive substance, and he became Clayface. But actually, Clayface has had several iterations over the decades. I mean, Basil Carlo and Matt Hagen were the first two, of course, but we've also had Sandra from Zimbalist Jr., who anyone listening to this podcast knows as the voice of Alfred Pennyworth.
Right.
Of course, he was also an accomplished television actor prior to joining Batman the Animated Series. Personally, I remember him best as Dandy Jim Buckley from Maverick. But he was also probably actually best known for his roles as Stu Bailey on 77 Sunset Strip and Inspector Louis Erskine on the FBI. Sadly, Mr. Zimbalist passed away on May 2nd, and he was 95 years old.
He will be missed.
On to better things. Psychology and Batman.
Right.
On this week's episode, we're focusing on the two-parter, Feet of Clay. And yes, we're doing both parts in this episode. The two episodes were written by Marv Wolfman and Michael Reeves, respectively. Wolfman, of course, a bit of a legend of the comics industry. He created Welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions, everyone. This is the only podcast, at least the only one that we know of, that psychoanalyzes every episode of Batman the Animated Series. My name is Brian Ward, and as always, I'm joined by the lovely and talented Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
Andrea, we're going to start the week off with a bit of a sad note, I'm afraid. This past week saw the death of